Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Anthony Surratt. I'm one of the co-curators, along with Allison Kreitz, of the exhibition Lineages, Artists Are Never Alone, which just opened at Southern Vermont Arts Center. We had a great opening over the weekend. And if you haven't seen the show yet, I hope you will. You will find that I think I'm biased, of course, but it's a compelling exhibition that's all about what influences us as creatives and the often overlapping lineages that we bring to the artistic world. So a couple of bits of housekeeping. You all, except for Harlan and I, should be muted. And please keep your microphone on mute throughout the talk. There will be Q&A peppered throughout, and if you want to ask a question, obviously unmute then. And we are going to be recording this conversation, and it will be available on SVAC's YouTube channel via the website soon. So I'm excited to kick us off. The exhibition, Lineages, Artists Are Never Alone, features the work of 11 artists. And we are very fortunate to have one of them here today to kick us off on a series of artist talks about the work. Harlan Mack is a lifelong Vermonter, and he is visual arts sculpture program director at the storied Vermont Studio Center. And we're delighted to have you here. And thanks for being the first artist to give a talk as part of this show.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
We're going to do this as kind of a conversation format. I've got a series of questions for Harlan, and feel free via the chat or raising your hand if you have questions for him. And again, we will have a formal opportunity toward the end for audience questions as well. So let's kick it off. Harlan, I love your work. You describe it as constellated storytelling. I love that description. I'm not sure that I could articulately describe what that means. So I'm hoping you could share with us what constellated storytelling means.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I would say that every time I try to articulate it myself, it's pretty constellated also. I wish I could remember specifically who I learned that term from. But it came about through actually some of the writers that I've had the privilege of connecting with here at the Studio Center, and that's actually probably one of the things I'll mention later, how much that's impacted my work, and even, as you can see with the term constellated, how I describe my work as well. But I guess the simplest way to sort of describe my understanding of having constellated narrative, or having my work sort of revolve around a constellated narrative, is that when I'm making my work, I don't think specifically about the linear timeline. I use the linear timeline. I'm aware of the linear timeline, but I'm not, I don't rely on the linear timeline for the work to evolve and for the work to sort of make its impression in the world. So I can show a piece just by itself and not talk about the narrative at all. So I like for it to sort of stand alone, but also I like to create it outside of the linear timeline. So it's sort of constellated on many levels.
Speaking of the narrative behind your work, one thing I like about it visually is it's so colorful, it's so powerful. It almost looks, when you first see it, joyous. But I know you have said that the cheeriness of the colors in your artwork belies darker undertones in your thematics, and that a lot of your subject matter is actually rather apocalyptic. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can't promise it won't be a long story, but I
Hey, long stories are good.
I I think I think about my my work as apocalyptic uh mainly because I think the portions of my work that I've shared or that I've created in the last decade or so have been around this part of this um, I would say several generations that have been depicted as like the apocalyptic portion, but they actually come after um, linearly speaking, they come actually after a long portion of world peace. I just haven't gotten around to showing that part yet.
It's
Um,
to come, huh?
yeah, yeah, even though
World peace is on its way.
those are actually the early years, but yeah, it's hard to describe. The narrative itself is a bit complex, and it took me a really long time to realize that that's what I was doing, and to really give myself permission to do that work. Um, I'm not somebody who actually believes in an apocalypse. If anything, I would say that I'm closer to believing that there are many, many little tiny, tiny ones that happen all the time, right? And I also I think I'm just fascinated by the multiple definitions of the term. The way people use the term apocalypse is pretty free of any sort of specific definition, right? It's like I think I've read a definition. I think that I believe is like a more formal definition, being that it's the final battle between good and evil where good prevails, right? And I don't know, I really know very few people who actually use that definition of the term. It's usually just the end of all things in the way we use it today. And that's certainly the way I was introduced to it. But I was sort of became more fascinated with the term apocalyptic as I got deeper into this type of work. Um, but I don't have any belief in them. In fact, I kind of was scared that I was making this work because visual art is really my most prized form of expression, and it felt really strange to be making something I didn't believe in. And that's sort of where this influence of writers has really been helpful. Um, I think early on, when I was in my MFA, so I started my MFA in 2007, I believe. Um, the I hadn't started this body of work, or at least I wasn't aware that I had started this body of work. And what I was noticing about my work was that there were these stories that always seemed to be kind of bad ones, right? And I didn't really enjoy that about myself. And like I'm actually a pretty optimistic person for the most part.
Right.
And it seemed like an odd thing to be involved with, especially in my most prized form of expression. And w- finding a way to give myself permission to do the work that I was just what seemed that I was like tied to.
Mhm.
Couldn't step away from doing that work, so I had to find a way to allow myself to do that. And at some point, it was a really simple answer, right? I was like, oh, writers create fiction all the time, and actually, those fictions are extremely powerful and in a lot of ways more honest than sometimes trying to tell the truth or trying to explain my beliefs might be. And I don't really have a whole lot of interest in sharing my personal beliefs or my opinions. But I think it's funny that the only opinion I tend to share is exactly that, that I believe that my opinions are likely to change. Right?
Right.
So I don't really feel the need to like express them as some sort of final entity. Um, So that that sort of idea allowed me and gave me permission to create a fiction and express the things that were on my mind as sort of a record. So I can sort of record my own reality through fiction.
And you've said that one of your characters in this narrative is death itself.
It really is. I actually don't tell everybody that, but I usually try to, if I'm engaging in the oral part of my practice, I try to uh, sort of share what I sense the person's ready for.
Mhm.
So if I were to be talking about an element of my narrative, I might stick to just the element of the depicted, the depicted element itself. Or if somebody seems to be um, willing or able to kind of hold on to where I might be going if I'm diving deeper, uh, I might share with them that actually the only character other than myself in this narrative um, that actually has a fully fleshed out identity is death. And then I know it sounds scary, but it's strangely fun. Death in this narrative gets bored and lonely and wants to retire, so creates an entire strategy, essentially a board game with its clone to teach it how to be a better spirit of death, which is
How to hang up its
yeah.
the job and go off to retirement, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And eventually it finds a way to succeed, but I think that that ending is actually really more of a beginning. Um,
Mm.
I think by the end of it, from my perspective, as far as I've gotten in discovering this story, we see that maybe there was never just one death in the first place, right? Um, that we don't actually know the limitations of these things, right? And that was sort of like the fun part for me, is to like realize myself that I was just creating a story that just continues to go and go and go. It fractals, right? But I think life often fractals for me, so it makes sense.
Harlan, I know you have slides of your work. Maybe this is a
Yeah.
good point to call some of those up and we'll take a look.
Okay. Well, let's see. Almost there, I see. Okay, well, that one makes sense. Um, so this first image here is actually, um, it's an older piece. I made this when I was 18 and I'm 44 now, but I was sort of just out of high school, but I started doing work um, like this as long as I can remember ago. But this one was the first sort of, I created a system, and I was, every time I made a piece like this, I would start with rules, and then by the end, I was engaged in breaking them. And
Mm.
I really appreciate that about visual art, is we find ways to break our own rules all the time, right? And it's just so funny that we even bother making them, but it's an interesting conversation, and I think it's a really essential part of being in dialogue with your work, or it can be anyway. It's a good example of being in dialogue with your work. Um, and the one of the reasons why I like to show this piece is because I think for me it was the first piece of artwork that I really thought of on a like a, a whole on I guess multiple levels of like complexity, but I thought about it um, as like a conceptual idea, as an expressive idea, um, as a skill building idea. You know, like there was just so many different levels to it, and I don't know if you can see in the image, but it's I think every part of this image is part of a face, right? And then there's multiple faces within it that are interacting. Um, and
What is the medium here?
this is ink on paper. And then later on in undergrad, I doubled the image, and this was like my show card in undergrad. So I just made sort of a digital background out of the image itself. I was just really just learning how to use Photoshop at the time. But the image, the black and white image that's doubled is the original image. And in the top right hand corner, where it kind of looks like it's sort of a different, it's a little bit warmer. Sorry, the top right hand corner of the doubled image, the black and white portion. There's a part that's a little bit warmer in color there, and that was a ballpoint pen. And this is how I used to teach myself how to draw. This was like every sketchbook I've ever had has these doodles in it. Um, so that right there, I think, is really the most. I think that's the. I think that's my hand, right? My original hand. That's how I taught myself how to draw. Right there was to like create this style of mark, these sort of scrolls and hash marks, all creating different values. I'm trying to like perfect getting the edge of contoured space, um, and that's what developed into this entire piece. Um, and
Y-
I think in my um, I had mentioned to you before with the story about my mom, um, or about seeing my mom's hand in her work, right?
Yeah, this is a great story. I'm glad you're bringing it up.
Um, yeah, yeah. So when I when I was a kid, my grandmother, my Oma, who's always been really supportive of me and my work as an artist, she is sort of she's always an archivist, so she kept an archive of my entire childhood. And when I was 18, she gave it to me as a gift. So right about when I was making this piece, she gave it to me. Oh, and the title of this piece is actually called 18. But she gave me my archive, and I was so nervous that I was not that I was going to damage it in some way. So I tucked it away. I packed up. I packed it in my things so far away that I couldn't get to it if I tried. Um, and I didn't look at it again or ever actually until I was in my early 30s. And when I did that, when I took it out and brought it here to Johnson with me, um, I looked, I was looking through my archives, and it was 4 volumes, and I looked at it out of order, of course, because can't do anything in straight line. My when I got to the first book, I opened up, or happened onto the first page eventually, and my grandmother did this thing where she would save letters and the envelopes. And the letter was from my dad, and it said, you know, Harlan Mack, newborn baby boy, you know, healthy newborn baby boy, 6 pounds, some odd ounces, born September 11th, 1980, all of the above. And I knew it was my dad's handwriting. I've been copying my dad's handwriting for ages. So I was curious if my mom had contributed to the letter at all, because my mother had passed away when I was 4. So I'm always sort of like interested in any sort of artifact from her. And uh, the envelope next to it had different handwriting. So I was excited that, you know, this is most likely my mom's contribution uh, to this letter. And then on the cover of the envelope was this doodle, just, you know, with one of my doodles on it. And I got really upset with myself. And I just wondered why I would ever draw on such an important document. And it took me a few minutes of being upset with myself before I realized that this was the first time I had ever seen this document, and that this was most likely this was actually my mother's contribution to the letter.
Wow.
Uh, that this doodle that I really could have sworn was mine, and it looked very much like what you see in the top right-hand corner of this piece, was actually my mother's. And to sort of further solidify that that was the case, there was also a repeated mark that was at the start of the letter that my dad had written.
Mm.
So the that doodle was actually repeated again before the letter starts. But anyway, it totally gave me chills when it does, and it still gives me chills today to know that something as intimate as like somebody's personal hand is could potentially be passed genetically, because I have no memory of ever seeing my mom's drawings or anything like that before. And it was a total surprise to me that she could.
That's a powerful illustration of lineage, literally.
Yeah, right. It really is. Yeah. I can show you some other work here. I wasn't always a sculptor, as you can see from this drawing, but I I mean, I can't stick to one thing anyway, but I began undergrad as a painter, and this is one of my oil paintings from undergrad. I really enjoyed going out into the forest of Johnson and finding things to paint. So this was a plein air painting of a old busted vehicle that was out in the forest near the college, and I loved going, you know, doing this for my painting classes. It was just like the most fun thing to do. I'd like go home for a few minutes, and then I rush out into the woods and paint a painting as fast as I could. So you get an idea of like the sort of broad spectrum of my color palette, um, and the I always thought of my color palette as being wide open. So I like to sort of employ a lot of colors. And I guess to sort of go back to your question earlier about my colors, the colors in general, I mean, this is already, you know, sort of approaching somber, but the colors that I'm using, I don't think of as somber colors. They're more like game board colors, right? Sort of more associated with the colors of our toys. And later on, that would play a big role when I sort of came back to using color again. But before I dive deeper into my painting and things, I was introduced to jewelry before sculpture. And this is an example of a wedding ring that I had made for a friend. And actually, I was introduced to jewelry by my colleague Layla Bandar, who's sort of my first mentor, really. She had she was running the sculpture shop here at the Studio Center in 2004, and she was teaching Sculpture One and jewelry. So I had a Sculpture One class with her. I still didn't think of myself as a sculptor in terms of my own expression, but then through jewelry, I really became fond of metal, and from there, picked up welding, and um, and then really started to realize that it was actually easier for me to achieve what was in my mind's eye through 3 dimensions,
Mhm.
or a little bit easier to sort of make a direct approach to expression, instead of sort of like constantly being in conversation with my mistakes. I would be like in conversation with what I was trying to solve in 3 dimensions. So this was a steel goat that I had made in undergrad, and I was sort of surprised myself. Like I just didn't know that I could do these things, and that's what this work was about. It was sort of about these were the toys that I would make if I had known I could make these things when I was a kid. So I made these animals that I love to climb all over, because I'm pretty sure my dad would have let me climb on them if I had them at home. And that kind of jumped into this element of storytelling had sort of begun through that, right? I hadn't quite made the connection between storytelling and play yet. It would still be some time before I actually made that connection for myself, but now it makes total sense that I would jump right into folk tales, and this was an image of sort of redesigned the image of John Henry, and it was, you know, this figure which was loosely modeled from my own dimensions. It's wearing my pants and my boots, and there's a a turbo from a car is in the heart, um, and a headlight for a face. And I think there's a little like fairy in its head with holding a book. Um, Eventually, I got sort of tired of looking at this piece, so I I would later change it 2 more times, and just keep reshowing it. This piece uh, is really about, well, this is actually just uh, an image that was a rendering from a photo, an old family photo, and that's my dad. Um, and he is driving a workhorse that we had. My dad is is extraordinary. He's a really great builder, and he's also an artist. He's a filmmaker, and he decided when he met my mom and conceived me and had gotten married that he was going to build a house in the same year, but he was going to move the family across the country to do it, and do it out in the middle of nowhere in Vermont with no electricity. And so this was Peter, and Peter was the horse that almost killed me as a child. And so I have a fondness for this horse. Apparently, I had also ridden this horse as a baby.
So a fondness for the horse that almost killed you.
Yeah, yeah. But I also just think that this image is like super badass of my dad.
Yeah.
So cool. So I was I was really getting into ink drawings at the time and trying to like teach myself how to do this. And I just sort of gotten to the point where I thought where I could actually do the things that I wanted, but it still wasn't like I was doing it perfectly every time. So the marks were loose and messy, but I actually liked um, I think that there's a certain amount of character and, you know, like the way that these marks made me feel was important.
Right.
And certainly I couldn't find that in the photo itself. oh, this is one of the changes. So I changed John Henry into this shortly after. And this is sort of that turning point where I started to create this narrative, or gave myself permission to create this narrative world. And so what John Henry is wearing now is a new set of the same pants. I had two pairs, and this one um, was, I needed to replace them because the other pair had been outside for too long. The boots held up. And then he's wearing this hat, which was my grandfather's hat that he had given me at one point. And on his back, got a he's got what I began calling a rage tank, which sounds like a really terrible name, but it's a tank for unwanted emotions, and that's actually what causes the world peace for several hundred, if not thousands, of generations. So I really can't wait to start making that work. Maybe I'll make that body of work next. But the rage tank is this object that is sort of the catalyst for world peace. And I could go on and on about its importance in the narrative and things, but essentially, if we were thinking about this narrative from the spirit of death, it would be an object inspired by this strategy that death had, knowing that it would cause world peace for some time, so that it would be easy to train its clone, because nothing would die from unnatural causes. So it would be a simple path toward learning.
And I think you mentioned that this piece has changed yet again.
It has, yeah. Now it's pushing. Now it's pushing the. My dad has this piece now, but it's pushing the rage tank in a shopping cart out in Washington, Vermont, at about 2,400 feet, just hanging out in the mountain where I grew up, pushing a golden shopping cart with a rage tank in it. I I could tell you all about why that was important to me to make that change, because there's, um, well, the rage tank itself is not something that I would say that I needed, but it's something that I felt like I was at the time when I developed the rage tank. And you know, it's a vessel for unwanted emotions, but I kind of felt like that's how I was beginning to see myself, or beginning to see like my strengths in that way. And then for in the narrative, I found it funny that it became this sort of like consumer item, and then led to this entire like you know totally wild world that I've spent over a decade, well over a decade at this point, um, creating. Um, but I guess that's all just coming back to me now. But um,
Fascinating.
yeah. And then this is where, so at the same time as I was doing that with my sculpture, um, I was, and giving myself permission to create this narrative world. And I guess I should take a step back. When I was doing the folk tales, um, I I kept veering off into these apocalyptic narratives. Like I would be like, oh, I'm going to do John Henry, and then I got bored with known folk tales immediately, and I started making my own folk tales, and they were always kind of dark, right? So that's where that's that crossing point when I had to find a way to accept or make it acceptable for myself to just continue making the work that was coming out of me. Often I just call it bleeding my work. But these paintings are done on, you can think of them as paintings or drawings. I think of them as both, but they're done on tar paper. I was introduced to tar paper from Brenda Garand, who's was at Dartmouth forever, right? And anyway, Brenda's amazing, and introduced me to tar paper, and also has this sort of, sculptural and two-dimensional background. So it was kind of nice that it took hold in the way that it did. And um, these paintings were all of a sudden started running, right? Like the narrative world building started to go so quickly because I was making this sort of concerted attempt to, or I was making this effort to make uh, sort of one layered paintings, so I wouldn't go back into them very far, if at all. And it took me about 10 years to like really learn how to do it. And in that 10 years, I bled, you know, thousands of works. Um, and what that meant is I wasn't using color. If I did, it was as monochromatic as I could possibly do. So maybe often one color, um, maybe added as a small highlight. And then after about a decade, I started to allow myself more and more color. It wasn't like a strict rule, but I really put a lot of effort into keeping these paintings as simple as possible. And I built an entire narrative world that way. So I didn't write any of it down. It's just all these paintings. And I would be happy to make the same imagery over and over and over. And then when something new popped up, I had to find out why and what it was. And that's how this whole um, narrative came. So if I was to look at this piece and tell you what was going on, these figures are standing around a rage tank, and the rage tank is this is post-apocalyptic rage tanks. So there's fewer of them left, and they're used as tools in a lot of ways. So small communities would keep them around to enjoy peace, or small communities would insert them into near their enemies' territory so that their enemies would be pacified, right? So they were this sort of complex object. And then these hooks that these people are carrying, these sort of, shepherd's staffs, are, or shepherd's hooks sort of are, they're modeled after these bottle openers I used to make. And I thought of them as these landing spots for dragonflies that had grown so large that people were afraid to live with them anymore. And the dragonflies, the connection to the dragonflies is that the dragonflies lived inside of these rage tanks, and it's what made them sustainable. So the dragonflies were actually what were consuming our unwanted emotions. They were nourished by them and lived that way. So the sort of dark side of this world piece is that there were these, magical creatures um, imprisoned. So the essentially this what ends world peace is that we are inspired by this clone of death. I'm sorry if I'm telling too much of this story, but we're inspired by this.
Oh,
We're inspired by this clone of death, and the clone has figured out that there's something in the way of it being good at its job. So, in order to be more successful, it decides to free these dragonflies by making the people sort of complacent about their emotions. So they can't tell the difference between a good emotion or a bad emotion. So they put the good ones in there, which are not nourishing. It's like eating candy for the dragonflies. And then the bad emotions are left uneaten. And then the tanks rupture and the dragonflies escape. And then I said that they had essentially goldfish syndrome. So every generation, they got a little larger to occupy the new sphere that they're in. So after several hundred, if not thousands more generations, these dragonflies wind up being the size of cities, and people fight entire wars against or alongside them. So these people here with the hooks would be dragonfly sympathizers, because when the dragonflies were the size of dogs and the wars had just begun, they would befriend the dragonflies and the dragonflies would land on their hooks. And this is early in the world building. I don't think I've drawn a hook in some time.
Right. Just a quick time check. I would love to hear about dragonflies and rage tanks for hours. We have about 15 minutes left, so just wanted to let you know that, and please keep walking us through your work.
So this is sort of another example of the painting as it sort of stepped into more colorful work, but it's still in this sort of darker place. It's still in this sort of like lonely planet with fewer people. I tend to do, I developed my own sort of numerology for this work. So often there'll be like 5 figures, sort of representing like the symbol of a hand, right? Like if your thumb is the leader, that would be death in this case, and then the fingers would be the witnesses, and those are the 4 fingers. And I chose that because of the you know, there really being 5 different horsemen of the apocalypse or something, because there's 5 images, 5 different images, which led to 5 different names. Just funny things that would come up, right, as I studied more and more what I was doing. So you'll see there's 4 towers and 1 rage tank in this piece. And in my steel work, I would often create a distillation of the work that I had already been developing. So if you were to look really closely at the rain and these coming from these rain clouds, these 4 towers of rain, there's actually dragonflies holding the rain all together. So this was sort of a representation of the symbols that I had developed at this time. And this was my part of my thesis exhibition for my master's thesis. Shortly after, or a couple of years later, I was working on this piece, still deeply entrenched in the same world. I don't think I ever left this space. And then this piece just keeps becoming more and more relevant, unfortunately. But this is a series that I called Beachfront Property and Other Disasters. And you can see how it, you know, that theme sort of carries on into these other things. But I'm exploring elements or different themes in here about companionship, sustenance, place, and labor in this, and also most directly, actually, identity.
And color is obviously becoming more and more prevalent as we progress through these works.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, eventually it gets to the point, this one's actually a blacklight painting. I spent just as much time painting this painting in a blacklight as I did in a regular light. I wish I could have an image of the blacklight painting as well. You'll just have to come and see it sometime. But
Yes.
this is the example of like when I really started to basically, you know, secure color again as part of my identity as a painter. I was comfortable that I was able to paint in all of my styles if I felt like it, in one painting if I felt the need. This is sort of maybe 5 or 6 layers of painting rather than just holding to one, but there's still elements of the painting that are still single layer, like the rabbits, the way that they're rendered is just one layer, which has been a really, really fun way to express myself and have these sort of very different types of, uh, I guess, expressing different emotions through different marks is the simplest way to put it. I was studying a lot of storyboarding for a while. Um, this painting, you can kind of see how this painting actually progresses a little in terms of putting the faces on. It wasn't something that I do, it's not something that I do frequently, but this kind of indicates a little bit about uh, the something I do in my work with faces is generally if I'm putting a face on a piece, it means that this person or this person is a family member. Um, so in this case, it's really these are actually depictions of death, but death is depicted as two members of my like future family. That's sort of how I'm thinking about it when I'm creating this. But that's really just death and its clone. So, um, and then here we get into the steel faces where they're all meant to be related to each other. Because I made the most successful in the narrative, I made the most successful object in the world, right? So I'm actually not even an artistic anymore in my fictitious future. I'm just a highly successful entrepreneur who has made a rage tank that everybody owns, and then my children's children's children are the rulers of the world. So this is a way of imagining, spirits that, like honoring spirits that haven't even been imagined yet, right?
I think you call these, is this work future in-laws?
Future kin.
Future kin, right?
That's this is the first way that I displayed this piece. This was at a show in New York, and then later the show went to Miami. I don't know if this picture was from Miami or if this one was in my studio, because it doesn't look like it's enough of them. I think I made 58 of them, and I spent 2 years making 58 of these and teaching myself how to freehand faces into steel. And this is quite thick steel. It's some of the steel is a little over 1/4 of an inch thick, but most of those are about 1/4 inch.
And many of those are now on the walls at SVAC.
Yeah. Yeah. And then this is the first instance of the shovel faces. And this is a distillation of the aspect of the narrative where I'm expressing the importance of labor and the complexity of labor in terms of uh, the individual identity of a laborer, and also like the complexity of our relationships to something as easily dismissed as a tool. So in this case, I've actually removed the face from all of the laborers to have this conversation, or to start this conversation around identity and labor. And then because I really wanted to be making these faces while I was doing this show, I changed all of the all of the figures to be holding shovels, because I realized that I had already distilled the uh, symbol that I use for labor into shovels, and I had 5 shovels, so I changed all the figures rapidly, and I gave myself as a reward the opportunity to put faces into the shovels.
Harlan, what's the significance of the color you chose for the figures here?
I had not been using color in my steel work, and had only really just begun using color in my 2D work again. And a really good friend of mine, Derek Adams, who's always been really supportive of me and my work, and he told me in his he gave me some advice that I should use more color in my steel, and that he's never steered me wrong, so I should try it at least once. So I did, on this piece. I went out on a limb, and I just used my favorite color at the time, which is essentially the color of fire in my 2D pieces. So this color is actually also this sort of multi-tonal fluorescent, orangey, pink, yellow, which is, I think, a good description of my favorite color at the time, which would be maybe somewhere between sunrise and sunset.
Mm.
Um, and the shovels with the faces on them actually spoke so much uh, of what I was reaching for with that piece originally. I started to just show the shovels. They're a lot easier to show, but actually this piece is in Baltimore now, at Derek Adams. Derek Adams has an artist retreat there called the Last Resort Artist Retreat. So really excited that my work is there in his sculpture garden. And then this piece is sort of it's related to the other piece, Future Kin, but it's done with the shovels itself and done with the same wood that the frames for Future Kin were in. And that piece is in Chicago. These are a few photos of the Rauschenberg residency, which was 2019. And you can see this expansive space there. And it really spoiled me to not just.
I can see why.
What's that?
I can see why. Yeah, this is.
This is Rauschenberg's studio.
Yeah.
And then it was a short residency because it was for arts administrators, and they didn't feel that arts administrators would have the time to get away, which was absolutely true. But it was so, from the moment that we got there, I just had to like sit down and be like, I can't believe I'm here. There's like a room in one of the buildings with like so many of my art heroes have their names on the wall. And I actually brought nothing to this residency. I didn't even bring one tool or paint or piece of paper or anything. I just thought, oh, I did bring my computer. I think I thought I might write a little because something that I forgot to mention before, one of the sort of attributes to this sort of nonlinear style of storytelling was gleaned from poets specifically. I have a lot of admiration for the way that poets generate their work, and I have a lot of conversations with poets, and I began studying and beginning to teach myself how to understand poetry in a way that I wasn't capable of doing before. And so I thought I might try my hand at poetry to sort of further solidify that connection. And I did write while I was there, but I couldn't keep myself away from these expansive walls. So I wound up making, I think, like 40 plus paintings while I
So
was.
you acquired some materials.
Yeah,
And you were quite prolific.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I got to use some leftover paints that were left there, and I didn't use a lot of color in these just because I was working too quickly, but there were more pieces than this, and there are a number of pieces still with color on them. But when I got home, I finished this piece, which is one of the pieces that's showing with you now.
Right.
And this one, I actually can't remember what its original title was, but I changed the title of this piece to the show title that I had first showed this with, and it's called In Light of Disuse. And it's really about how we have not spent enough time paying our attention or paying our respect to our future. In the same ways that we learned how to pay respect to our ancestors, I wanted to use those techniques to pay respect to our future, but at the same time as being pretty honest about the direction that like these, you know, about the direction that, you know, we see like our environment going in general. But this is all directly tied to like the narrative. So this is showing, you know, the aftermath of that wacky like world that was developed during world peace, which makes me really, really excited to like start depicting like the world peace scenes like before the flooding and the awkwardness of all of this, and to see how these people really like glowed and thrived. So this is a bit of a distillation, and of the actual original idea of future kin that was actually meant to be a three-dimensional piece similar to this image, but I couldn't never have quite had the space to do that yet. So I'm looking forward to having that space. These are some images of being in being at a symposium in China. This was a piece. This was maybe the largest steel sculpture I've ever made. I think it's almost about 4 meters tall. And it's also a distillation of my narrative work. And you can see the dragonfly there carrying a ship with a person with a bunny. And that's sort of leading up to the end of the narrative where in the end of the narrative, it's we all basically we learn that it would be better for us to ride on the backs of these dragonflies because they will be the only land to live on eventually. And sort of we have to like live on the backs of our enemies in order to survive while the world finishes doing its chrysalis or enters into its chrysalis. So you're gonna have to ask me more about this another time because I could just keep going and going.
Yeah, I think that's probably an appropriate place to end this part of the talk. But obviously, you have a lot more to share, and I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask, but I'm respectful of our guests' time. I will open it up if any of our viewers has a pressing question, please ask it. And we thank you for being with us. This has been an amazing talk, Harlan, and I do think this has to be just the first one of several, allowing you to continue these thoughts. Any questions from our viewers?
Looks like there's a question in the chat from Sherry, asking if I've read Christopher Moore's books, Secondhand Souls and A Dirty Job. I have not, but I'm writing it down now.
And looks like Suzette has her hand up. Let's see if you'll unmute yourself, Suzette. Hello.
Hi, I'm just really fascinated by the trajectory, the differences between where you started as 18, the evolution into the painting, and then when we got to the sculptures, it was like you really found who you are working in 3D with the metal and the wood. And I would love to know more about the work that you did when you were in China, because it really has a very I'm not sure quite the word, but compared to the stuff that we're seeing at the Wilson Museum, it has a very different overall, oh sorry buddy, overall appearance and spirit to it. And I'll mute it.
Oh no, thank you for that question. I think that with the piece in China, it was maybe the first thing that I was able to do at the scale that my heart was in after coming back from the Rauschenberg residency. And that sort of made, right, because I did the Rauschenberg residency actually at the end of 2018, and then it was early 2019 when I did the symposium in China, and I'd sort of my heart had sort of needed that space again, but that work was actually really just like maybe one of the most direct distillations of my symbol. So I was pulling actually from maybe it was like taking a large view of a portion of that narrative work and distilling it down as much as possible. Like the form of that piece is actually, if you look at it from the side, is meant to represent like pages of a book. So I feel like I was trying to hit all of the larger elements of the sort of the ending of that narrative world.
Well, Harlan, thank you so much for this. This has been a wonderful talk, and I feel like I've been fortunate throughout this process to have several conversations with you, and I've learned so much more even tonight. And as Suzette Marie said, seeing the progression of your work is very telling and enriching. So thank you so much for your time and your stories. Thanks everyone who joined us. Again, this will be posted on SVAC's YouTube page, accessible from the svac.org soon. And I'll leave it there and just say again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.